Our Bible study today is on Daniel chapter 8, beginning at verse 1. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you continue to reveal your will to the world as Daniel saw this vision and saw the future of the coming of the Persian and the Greek empires. We know, Lord, that you are preparing him for the persecutions that would come to the people of God. And we still see that happening in our world today, even as Jesus saw that persecution and was killed on the cross, and even as Christians will be persecuted till the end until Christ returns. We thank you, Lord, that you've given us your word to comfort us and to strengthen us until the time that you deliver us. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so as we get into this new chapter, this is the first section of the book where we have visions that are in the Hebrew language. Because remember, the book of Daniel is divided up into, it has like a prologue. Chapter 1 was in Hebrew, and then chapters 2 through 7 were in the language called Aramaic, which is, a language that was spoken among the Persians and from the 400s all the way through. And then the Jewish people continued to speak it all the way through the first century when Jesus was alive. It was pretty soon after Jesus' time period that Aramaic fell out of use. And then, because the official language was Greek, but then Latin took over pretty soon after that. But we see, that on the cross when Jesus is, the sign above his head on the cross was written in Hebrew, because it was proclaiming to the Jews that Jesus was the King of the Jews, and Greek, and in Latin, right? So Greek was the common language of.
Or Aramaic?
I think it was in Hebrew. And I don't know, maybe we'll look it up and see. They look the same because the letters are the same letters. But the Greek language was the official language of commerce and the common language of the Roman Empire. But Latin became that was like the legal language, and that took over pretty soon after that. But at the time of Daniel, of course, Aramaic was the official language used in the Babylonian Empire and, of course, in the Persian Empire. And so when you have chapters 2 through 7 in Aramaic, most likely it could have been drawn from official reports and writings that were used in the Babylonian Empire, because he quotes Nebuchadnezzar directly, right? So where did he get that? Maybe he says he made a decree, so maybe he was just copying the decree in his book. But then he switches back to Hebrew in chapter 8 through 12, the end of the book, and he kind of repeats some of the visions. The other visions were, there was chapter 2 that was Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the statue, and then Daniel had a vision in chapter 7, and so he's proclaiming these to the nations and the kings that he's serving, in order to speak their language, to proclaim what God's will is for their life. But then chapters 8 through 12 are really for the people of God, not intended to be directed towards the people of the empire. Okay, so one thing we'll find in this chapter is that it's kind of a retelling of some of the ideas and the visions that are back in chapters 2 and 7. But instead of having a 4-kingdom description like you see in the statue, 4 types of metal, and in the vision of the 4 animals in chapter 7, we only have two beasts in this chapter 8. So Daniel's vision, some people think that this is kind of superfluous, because those other 2 visions talked about the 4 kingdoms, which included the 2 middle kingdoms that are part of this chapter. So why in the world is chapter 8 even here? Because it's repetitive, right? But that's part of apocalyptic literature, is that it uses a secular way of describing things. So it's like it shows us the same thing over and over and over again from different perspectives. So why does it? We'll talk about why does it exclude the first kingdom and the 4th kingdom from the previous 2 visions? Because here it's only talking about a ram and a goat. as the symbols of the Medo-Persians and the Greeks. And we'll see that it most likely it's because he wants to focus, well, God is revealing to him what's going to happen in the near future. I mean, we're talking about really near future, because remember, if you look at the first verse, it says, "In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me." So which one was he talking about that had already appeared to him? Because the two visions I was talking about, one was from Nebuchadnezzar, one was from him. So the previous chapter, right? So this predates everything before chapter 7. In fact, it predates the section, it goes all the way back to when Belshazzar was on the scene, right? So because chapters 5 and 6 are talking about Belshazzar, the final king of the Babylonians. So in essence, chapter 8 is kind of like a preview. So why does it come so late in the book? Well, once you get to chapter 8 through 12, you're kind of going in a chronological order of Daniel's visions, but everything else before this was talking about his interactions with the kings. So that's why it's kind of going back, before when he was serving under Belshazzar. And this part, and then actually one of the questions that I'm considering for us today is that first one there says, why do you think Daniel only had a vision of 2 kingdoms and not 4 like in chapter 7? And why was the Babylonian Empire left out of this vision even while he served under the last Babylonian king, Belshazzar? So we can talk about that a little bit now before we get into the interpretation. What do you think?
What do I know? But it's prophetic. He's already in the Babylonian thing.
That's right. Why talk about something you're already in? It's not so prophetic then. This is prophetic because this is going to happen. So when do you think the vision of the ram and the goat are the Medo-Persian Empire and the Greek Empire? So when are the Medes and the Persians going to take over?
539 BC.
That's right, 539 BC. So, and
I got a chart here, but tell something.
that's right. So he's most likely less than 10 years from the time of this vision, because apparently this vision, he says it takes place in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar, which was most likely around 548, and the fall of Babylon was when King Cyrus the Persian took over in 539. So it's like 9 years. 9 years later is when this vision is going to take place. So it's probably because he wants to prepare him for what's coming, and of course prepare the people of God of what's coming. And it's not only that the Medes and the Persians are going to take over the Babylonians, which is he's going to live to see that, but he's not going to live to see the goat, which is the Greek Empire, take over. He'll be dead by then, but it's going to be super important for the people of God, because that's going to be like a huge time of testing for the Jewish people. And a lot of them are, it's going to be a very violent time. A lot of people will be killed. A lot of people will be shocked at the destruction that's going to happen by the Greeks. And so we'll look at not only specifically who is being talked about, which is we've got Alexander the Great, who took over. He destroyed the Medes and the Persians in between 334 and 331. Only a 3-year period. He basically decimated all the cities that they had taken in Asia Minor. He came from Greece and he tried to recapture all these cities. And it wasn't so much that Alexander the Great was trying to create a huge kingdom. He was upset with how the Persians had encroached, because they had come all the way from Mesopotamia all the way to Asia Minor, modern day Turkey, and they took all the cities along there, and then they were going to, they probably would have gone across the Bosporus and tried to take over Greece as well. So this is kind of like this is a battle to try to regain their previous territory. They were upset and angry at the Persians, but they didn't stop there, because once Alexander the Great swept through Asia Minor and reclaimed all his territory, he took over everything. I mean, he wiped out the whole Persian Empire after that. And so this is going to be, God's going to show how he's going to punish the Persians for their pride, but he's also going to show the danger of this new enemy. This is an age-old problem in the Bible, is why does God use evil empires to carry out his will? I mean, that was the question that Habakkuk asked God in chapter 2, verse 4, where he says, "How long, O Lord? How long?" Because he was saying, how long are you going to let these Assyrians keep hurting and destroying God's people in Israel? Right? They wiped out the 10 tribes of the north. They destroyed Samaria under King Sargon II in 722, wiped out the whole northern kingdom. And then they came down to surround Jerusalem and almost wiped that out. But then, Hezekiah the king, during the time of Isaiah, prayed for God's help, and he saved the city. But God proclaimed that in Habakkuk that he was going to send the Babylonians to punish the Assyrians for their pride. And now, in essence, God is telling Daniel the same thing. He's going to send the Greeks to punish the Persians for their pride, and then the same thing is going to happen eventually, because the Greeks are going to be so powerful and evil that God's going to send which country to put them down for their pride? Sorry, the Romans. So he doesn't mention the Romans in this chapter, but we're going to see that he's going to talk about it later on, because we still have some more chapters to the end of Daniel. Okay, so one thing that's important to understand is that in the height of the Greek Empire, Alexander the Great, he died in 323, and when he died, he had 2 young sons that were quickly assassinated so that they couldn't grow up to become the leaders, and his 4 generals took over the world and divided it up. And so those 4 generals ruled over the Middle East at that time, and one of them in particular became very evil, and he's the one that's going to be described in the middle section, talking about the trampling the holy place. Like if you see verse 13, and it talks about a vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, and the surrender of the sanctuary of the host that will be trampled underfoot. So that is a description of a specific king called Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Right, so Antiochus IV is his name. Epiphanes means revelation of God. So he basically tacked onto the end of his name that he was a divine being in the presence of humans. And so he wanted to be worshipped, of course. And because of his desire to be worshipped, he desecrates the temple of Israel in Jerusalem. And so actually, even though Daniel he's foreseeing this, the books of 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees in the Apocrypha is an actual Jewish history of what happened during that time, or right after that time. So maybe before we get into for the part of our background, let me read to you part of 1st Maccabees. So Maccabees is, found often in Catholic Bibles. Luther, he translated it into German. He didn't exclude it from the Bible, but he said it wasn't on the same level as God's Word, so he put it as an appendix at the end. And then a lot of the printers said, well, why are we going to print an appendix? It costs so much money to print books, and nobody's, the only people who would buy them would be like the emperors and stuff like that. So a lot of them just did away with it. So they didn't print the Apocrypha because it would cost too much money, and they figured if it's not part of the Bible, then we're not even going to print it. So a lot of the earliest Bibles, like the Gutenberg Bible, I don't think it included the Apocrypha because, when Luther's Bible was translated in German, those Bibles did not include it for sure. I don't know about the Gutenberg Bible. But let me read to you a section from Maccabees. So this was probably written around 140 BC, right? So 140 is like 20 years after the time that the Greeks had been defeated by the Maccabees, right? The word Maccabee means Hammer, and it is the name is a nickname for a family who fought against the Greeks, and they were trying to free Israel from the Greek Empire. Sounds familiar, right? The Jews are always fighting against somebody trying to destroy their empire, or at least their land, that is. Okay, so in First Maccabees chapter 1 verse 1, and it's set up kind of like the Bible, right? It's got chapters, it's got verses, but it's written in Greek. It's not written in Hebrew like the Old Testament is. That's why the Jewish people don't accept it as God's word, as well as it wasn't written by a prophet, and it also doesn't foretell the coming of a Messiah. It's just the historical struggle of the Jews with the Greeks. Okay, so it says, after Alexander, son of Philip, the Macedonian, who came from the land of Kittim, had defeated Darius, king of the Persians, and the Medes, he succeeded him as king. So it's exactly what Daniel is seeing in his vision. So Maccabees is actually showing the fulfillment of that prophecy of Daniel. And it goes on to say, he had previously become king of Greece. He fought many battles, conquered strongholds, and put to death the kings of the earth. That is, Alexander the Great. He advanced to the ends of the earth and plundered many nations. When the earth became quiet before him, he was exalted and his heart was lifted up. He gathered a very strong army and ruled over countries, nations, and princes, and they became tributaries to him. After this, he fell sick and perceived that he was dying. Right, so Alexander the Great, it was in 323 he had been coming back from, he had extended his kingdom all the way to India, right, from Greece east to India, and then on his way back he was in Babylon, and he died there. And so it says in here in verse 6, so Alexander summoned his most honored officers who had been brought up with him from youth, and divided his kingdom among them while he was still alive. And after Alexander had reigned 12 years, he died. So apparently he had like yellow fever or something like that. Then his officers began to rule, each in his own place. They all put on crowns after his death, and so did their sons after them for many years, and they caused many evils on the earth. From them came forth a sinful root, Antiochus Epiphanes, son of Antiochus the king. He had been a hostage in Rome. He began to reign in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks, which is 175 BC. In those days, lawless men came forth from Israel and misled many, saying, let us go and make a covenant with the Gentiles round about us. For since we separated from them, many evils have come upon us. So those would be, remember, the Jewish people who decided to kiss up to their rulers, the Hellenists. So Hellenists are people who adopt the culture in order to, not get attacked. So that means that they'd probably, during the time of Jesus, the Sadducees who ruled the temple were more like the Hellenists. They were the ones who were more pro-Roman than the Pharisees who were anti-Roman. This proposal pleased them, and some of the people eagerly went to the king. He authorized them to observe the ordinances of the Gentiles. So, doing stuff like, what do the Greeks like to do? What are some of the things? What were they known for? What was it? Yeah, the sports competitions, going to watch the games in the Colosseum, to go to the bathhouses, wear togas instead of, don't let your beard get all shaggy, they'd be more trimmed and stuff like that. Okay, in verse 14 it says, so they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to the Gentile custom, and removed the marks of circumcision, right? So they stopped having circumcision as part of the covenant because, none of the Greeks did that, so we don't want to stand out, because in the bathhouses, of course, you're naked and everybody could see. If you couldn't see, it probably wouldn't have made a difference. But they joined with the Gentiles and sold themselves out to do evil. So these are the Jews who became Hellenists. When Antiochus saw that his kingdom was established, he determined to become king of the land of Egypt, that he might reign over both kingdoms. So he basically tried to attack the Ptolemies in the south. Okay, I'm going to skip past that stuff and then go to the part where he where he was going to set up the statue of Zeus in the temple of Jerusalem. Okay, and then let's see here. Okay, well, let's see if we look at looking at verse chapter 2 of 1 Maccabees, verse 19. Matthias answered in a loud voice, "Even if all the nations that live under the rule of kings obey him," that is Antiochus IV, "and have chosen to do his commands, departing from the religion of his fathers, yet I and my sons and my brothers will live by the covenants of our fathers. Far be it from us to desert the law." So what they were trying to do is force people to eat pork and to just live like Helen, like the Greeks, and so he wouldn't do it. And so Matthias was the leader of the what became the Maccabees. He had the nickname Hammer, and so he fought against them. It started a rebellion, and okay, well, so Antiochus IV started a worship for Zeus inside of the temple, and he desecrated it, which is what Daniel what Daniel will talk about in Daniel 8:14, and then Matthias and his family, who led the rebellion called the Maccabee Rebellion, they conquered the Greeks in the city of Jerusalem, and then they rededicated the temple. So apparently the desecration of the temple in Jerusalem happened in 165 BC, and actually Kislev 25, the 25th of Kislev, and it was rededicated 3 years later in 168. And so here's a description of that in 1 Maccabees chapter 4. It's in 1 Maccabees 4, verse 45. "So they tore down the altar and stored the stones in a convenient place on the temple hill until there should come a prophet to tell them what to do with them. Then they took the unhewn stones as the law directs and built a new altar like the former one. They rebuilt the sanctuary and the interior of the temple and consecrated the courts. They made new holy vessels and brought the lampstand and altar of incense and table into the temple. Then they burned incense on the altar and lighted the lamps and the lampstands and gave light to the inside the temple. They placed the bread on the table and they hung the curtains. Thus they finished all the work they had undertaken. Early in the morning on the 25th day of the 9th month, which is the month of Chislev, in the year 148th year, they rose and offered sacrifices as the law directs on the new altar of burnt offering that they had built." So this is 164 BC. And so they rededicated the temple. And does anybody know what that celebration is called? Hanukkah. See? So even though it's not in the Old Testament, it's not in the New Testament, it happened in between. And the proclamation how this king would be overthrown eventually, the evil ruler of the Greeks that Daniel's going to talk about, they were able to celebrate God's victory over their enemies. And so Hanukkah is the celebration of the rededication of the temple. And that happened, like I said, in 165. Yeah, 165 BC. And that celebration, Jesus celebrated it actually. It mentions him having the festival of lights that happens around Christmas time for us. And of all the Old Testament festivals, it's the only festival that is not in the Old Testament, but Jesus still celebrated it. It's in the Apocrypha. Okay, well, let's look back at Daniel, and we'll maybe look at some of those details later on. But I reread verse 1, so starting at verse 2 of chapter 8.
"In my vision I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, in the province Elam. In the vision I was beside the Ulai Canal."
Okay, so notice he's saying that he saw, in my vision I saw myself. So he's not just seeing a vision, but he's seeing himself in a vision. And so where is he currently? Because it says he was in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar. So what country was he in? Yeah, he was in Babylon, in the city of Babylon, which is the name of the country, is named after the capital. But where is Susa? What is Susa? It's a city, and it is the capital of the Persian Empire. Susa is it's south along the Tigris and Euphrates River, right? So the Tigris and Euphrates River kind of look like a little figure eight, kind of laying on its side up in the northern part of the Middle East, and Babylon is kind of in the middle, and then Susa is way down closer to the Persian Gulf, and so that was the capital city of the Persian Empire, and so he sees himself in the capital of the country that's about to destroy the Babylonians, and Elam was the province, like the state, and then Susa was the city, and the Ulai Canal. So they had the city of Susa was next to the river. It wasn't on the river the way that like Babylon was, where they remember we talked about how they snuck in through the gates of the city because they built part of the city over the river, and so you can get in that way. But this one actually had canals that fed the water from the river to the city of Susa, so that people would be able to wash and to drink, and so they didn't have to go to the river. The river came to them with the canals that they had into the city. Okay, verse 3.
I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last.
Okay, so the first creature in his vision is a ram, and with 2 horns. So what do you think that the 2 horns represent?
2 countries?
That's right, 2 powers within this one beast, right? So, and we're going to see that because he says that the one of the horns was longer and one of them was shorter. Okay, so what does the short horn represent? Okay, remember which kingdom is going to destroy? Because he just saw himself in Susa, the Persians. But the Persian Empire was not just the Persians; it was the Medes and the Persians, right? So that's why you got 2 horns. And so a little bit of the background behind this is that Cyrus is the one who came to the throne when the Medes dominated the Persians. So originally the Medes were the ones who were dominating the Persians. Now Cyrus his father was Median and his mother was Persian, right? So when Cyrus overthrew his grandfather Astyages, who was a Mede, when he overthrew his grandfather, he united the 2 kingdoms into one. So then that would mean that the short horn represents the Medes who were dominating up until the point that Cyrus took over, and then the longer horn would be the Persian part of the empire that ended up from Cyrus through the rest of the Persian emperors until the Greeks took them over. And so that longer horn represents this part of the empire that was more significant and more powerful. I mean, the Medes were pretty powerful, but once they combined under the Medes and the Persians, they were even more powerful. They were the ones who, like I mentioned, had taken all those cities in Asia Minor during the time. So there'd be like Cyrus and Xerxes and Artaxerxes, which we read about in like the book of Esther, right? So we're going to read about those kingdoms, and the Persian Empire continued to get stronger and stronger, and they kept encroaching until the Greeks couldn't take it anymore, and then they decided to start a war and try to wipe out the Persians.
So the shorter one was
the Medes, and the longer one represents the Persian part of the empire. But it's still one beast, because it wasn't as if when Cyrus took over, he just defeated his grandfather. I don't know if he assassinated him or something like that, but he was half Mede and half Persian anyways. So everybody just followed him, and he didn't have to wipe out any empire in order to take it over. He basically it was a coup, and he took it over and united. Because everybody who was, if you're a Mede or a Persian, because he was both, he got loyalties from both sides. And so that's the longer horn. Okay, next. Let's see.
It says a large horn, my footnote says a large horn was broken off, which would be Alexander. What does that mean?
Okay, well, which verse is that though?
Wait, we're farther down.
Yeah, that's further down.
Okay,
That's once we get into the other beast.
Yeah,
Okay, so we just read verse 3,
Not the ram.
and then verse 4.
I watched the ram as it charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its powers. It did as it pleased and became great.
Okay, so because once Cyrus took over and the Medes and the Persians were under his control, this ram, this kingdom, it says that it ran or it charged west, north, and south. So what are the areas of the ancient world that Medo-Persia conquered? Well, to the north of the Medes and the Persians were the Babylonians, right? So that's the north. And who was to the south of the Persians? What country did he defeat? Did they defeat? What was the biggest country in the south? Egypt, right. So Egypt, it was kind of south, because you couldn't just go across the desert. You had to go up and over and then down through Israel. So, yeah, but it was south of Susa. And then who was the country to the west? West of Mesopotamia? Which is the area that I mentioned how they destroyed all those city-states that were part of Greece at one time in Asia Minor. But does anybody know the name of the country that was called that was Asia Minor? Today it's Turkey, and then the time of the Persians it was called Lydia. Lydia is the name of the west, so that was directly to the west, Asia Minor or Turkey today, and the Greeks called it Anatolia. So Anatolia was what they had, and then the Persians kept encroaching and taking over a bunch of cities, and then trying to bring them into the Persian Empire, and that was something that caused the warfare between the Greeks and the Persians because of that. Okay, because it says no animal could stand against him, and none could rescue from his power. So when the Persians were attacking all these cities in the west, especially in Lydia, nobody from Greece was able to help them. I mean, they didn't have the manpower, they didn't have the ability. Nobody even came. They basically kind of gave them up in the beginning, right? So these cities were taken over, and then they didn't do anything. It'd be like, I don't know, I guess like when America took over part of Mexico and annexed it, and then the people of Mexico couldn't do anything about it, and then they didn't try. Those people got kind of abandoned. Right? And that's true in lots of different places in the world. If you attack an area and you can hold on to it long enough, then people forget where it originally came from. So that's what Putin's trying to do with Ukraine right now. He's trying to take it over and hoping to hold on to it long enough that people will forget that it once belonged to the Ukrainians, and he's claiming something even older. He's saying, at one time Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, so it's always been Russian. So we're just bringing it back home. But the people there don't like that. So, there's always going to be countries going back and forth, and the Bible just shows us how the human character of trying to do these power plays is humans trying to control the future. But ultimately, the only one who controls the future is God. The future is in his hands. And these people are pawns on God's chessboard. Okay. And it says that he did as he pleased and became great. So notice it's using the word he as if it's talking about one king, but it's talking about the kingdom of the Persians, the Medes and the Persians. And it started specifically with the power of Cyrus, but it extended through Xerxes and Artaxerxes until they were finally defeated by Alexander the Great, which is going to be described in the next couple of verses. So verse 5.
without touching the ground.
So notice that whereas the ram before it had 2 horns, this is a goat which has how many horns? 1 horn in between its eyes. So it shows the power and the unification of this kingdom through the 1 horn, in the beginning at least. So this is supposed to be Alexander the Great, that he's the one who... Now think about it, because it talks about it came from the west, so it's obviously west of where Babylon, when he had the vision, and even west of Susa, which is, this is Greece. And it says he crossed the whole earth without touching the ground. It shows the swiftness. Now remember, back in chapter 7, Daniel had a vision of the 4 kingdoms, and when he talked about the Greek kingdom, what did he call it? Remember, there was the 4 beasts in chapter 7. Let's see, do I have it written down? In chapter 7, verse 6.
Leopard.
Yes, the leopard. And what was the leopard described as? A leopard with? Well, leopards are pretty fast, but this leopard had wings. So it was even faster. And here it talks about not touching the ground. So it really is the same picture as the leopard with the wings that was able to swiftly take over the world. And so he's seeing this other, and why are they changing the metaphors? Well, because apocalyptic literature is symbolic. And part of the symbolism is to throw off anybody who it wasn't meant for. So, if you're Jewish, you're going to be able to say, oh yes, that must be this empire because the symbolism matches what we know about this, that, or the other thing. Whereas the people from Babylon at this time would, if they grabbed hold of this scroll and they read it, they would say, this is ridiculous. It doesn't make sense to us, because they wouldn't understand. So Daniel is changing the type of the beast. But notice that if the Medes and the Persians are a ram, and the Greeks are a goat, what's the difference between rams and goats?
Sheep and goats.
That's right, the sheep and the goats. The sheep are pretty, usually tamer. And what are goats more like? They like to butt heads, that's right. They're very aggressive. I mean,
So are rams.
yeah. Well, but the ram is still from the family of sheep, right? It's the most aggressive of the sheep, but the goats are more aggressive than sheep in general. So I don't know. Maybe you can argue that rams and goats are probably just as. But rams can maybe attack for their territory, but goats, they don't have any sense. They'll just eat up stuff, and then they'll go places they're not supposed to. They'll butt you out of their way. So the description of the kingdom of the Greek Empire is being pictured as this aggressive goat that doesn't even touch the ground as it sweeps to the east. Okay, next verse 6.
He came toward the 2-horned ram, and I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at him in great rage.
Okay, so this is usually described by historians as the attack of Alexander the Great on Anatolia, where he crossed over the Bosporus from Greece over to Asia Minor, and he took back those 4 city-states that had been taken by the Persians. Okay, and so this is great rage. Alexander the Great, he never lost a battle against the Persians. It was pretty amazing. I mean, even in that time of the world, that it wasn't as if the Persians were weak. It's just that the Greeks were so much better at warfare at this time. Maybe they advanced some technologies with spears and with shields, but usually we associate a lot of that technological leap in warfare to the Romans. That's why the Romans were considered in the first vision from chapter 2 as the legs of iron, because they're almost immovable, so super strong. Okay, but it's not even going to talk about the Romans, and it's kind of dismissed the Babylonians, because the Babylonians are as good as gone at the time that he had this vision. They were going to only be around 9 more years. Okay, and then verse 7.
I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram and broke his two horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power.
So, the final battle of the Greeks and the Persians. The Greeks destroyed the Persian Empire, and was it the year that happened? Like 331. I'm sorry, no. Yeah, the 331 was the end of was when the Medes were taken over by the Persians, and then the Persians were defeated eventually by Alexander the Great. And let's see. Yeah, so the shattering of the horns just shows the ending of that previous empire. Okay, let's see. Next verse.
Then the goat came exceedingly great, that when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 conspicuous horns, who were the 4 winds of heaven.
Okay, and so as we know from history, after the Greek Empire started strong with that one unified horn, and when it broke off, that represents what? Yeah, death of Alexander, which I mentioned was 323 BC. And then the 4 horns that took its place, that grew up, those would be the 4, and we read about that in First Maccabees. Remember, it says that the death of Alexander, because he was dying, and so he passed on to his successors, his 4 generals, and so that represents the 4 kingdoms. They were called the Diadochi, the successors of Alexander. There was Cassander, who ruled Macedonia and Greece. There was Lysimachus, who took over Thrace and Asia Minor, which is Turkey, which is the area that we're just talking about now. And then Seleucus, who was the ruler of Syria and Mesopotamia, and then the kingdom of the Ptolemies, which ruled over Egypt. And so what we're going to find is that it's under the Seleucids that the kings who ruled in Syria and really that was they called Israel Syria at that time. They just kind of lumped it together with the kingdom of Syria. Is that Antiochus IV is the guy who tried to rid his kingdom of these other religions, right? So the Jewish people, he didn't mind if they were doing their thing as long as they acknowledged his gods, right? And that's what a lot of the kingdoms of the world tried to do. They tried to assimilate, and this is actually a very common practice. Is when you take somebody over, you want them to assimilate so that they will no longer think of themselves as anything different than part of your kingdom. There's nothing wrong with assimilation in some ways, but we can't get rid of every aspect of a person's previous nature. We talked about America as being the great melting pot, and everybody should be assimilated and learn the language. But that doesn't mean that they should forget their old language or that they shouldn't be able to worship their own religions beforehand. So whereas the Assyrians and the Babylonians tried to make the Jewish people get rid of their religion, when the Persians took over, they were a little bit different. They had allowed the Jewish people to worship their gods and even rebuild their temple, which was really unusual. It's almost like they figured because the Jewish people were fighting so much against the Babylonians that if we allow them to have their religion, maybe they'll be kinder. They'll work with us better, right? And so that's one of the strategies that the Persian Empire was able to use, and it was also part of God's plan to allow the Jews to rebuild the temple. But then the Greeks, of course, went the opposite direction, and they fought against the Jews. And so what happened when the Romans came into power? How did the Romans treat the Jews at first? Yeah, kindly. Well, so they did what they did is they said they saw that the Greeks blew it and they couldn't do it. They couldn't break them down. So they said, if we can't beat them, let's join them. So they said, okay, you Jewish people, you can worship your own God. You can have your own temple. But one thing is you have to pay us taxes in order to do it. So they had to pay a special temple tax. They had to pay all kinds of other taxes so they could keep their religion. So the Romans were kind of like the Persians in that they allowed the Jews to worship their God without forcing them to worship the other gods, right? Okay, so verse 9.
Out of one of them came another horn, which started small, but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land.
Okay, so now we're talking about this other horn that comes out of these four horns. So this is the prominent, or at least it's the king of one of these four kingdoms, or four rulers of the Greek Empire. And so we're talking about, this is the Seleucid king, Antiochus IV. Now, we'll see who it is because the description matches him. But what does it mean that it grew in power to the south and to the east? Because we know that in history that because Syria and Israel were ruled by the Seleucids, but then this one guy came along and he tried to take over the Ptolemies in the south. So he actually attacked Egypt. So before they were like four rulers of the Greek Empire and they all agreed to stay out of each other's backyards. But then he broke that rule. And so in history we know that Antiochus IV actually attacked the families to the south, which was Egypt. And also it says into the east. So the east is back towards Mesopotamia, which also would have been ruled by that was so Lysimachus ruled over Asia Minor, so trying to take over some of that area. And what is the beautiful land? That's right, Israel. Yeah, so this is Israel. Okay, in verse 10.
It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry hosts down to the earth and trampled on them.
Okay, so remember, we're using symbolism to describe, to keep the information away from the people who, who Daniel served, right? So the Babylonians or anybody else. It uses picture language. So the beautiful land is Israel, and so who are the hosts of the heavens? Think about, the description of who are the people that are going to be attacked, because it says that he threw this one king is going to throw down the starry hosts and trample on them. Usually we think of like the hosts of heaven, sounds like angels, right? Right? But it's believers. There we go. So it's actually the people of God. So this is a description of God's people, the hosts of heaven. So even in the book of Revelation, it tells us, and I think we looked at that last time, is that the thrones that are going to be set up when the Son of Man returns to judge will be there's God the Father, and there's the Son, and then there's the people of Israel will also sit on thrones. But the angels are the ones who are standing. So this is not talking about angels, but the hosts of heaven are God's people. And maybe we can describe them as martyrs, because if they're up in heaven. But it also talks about how they were thrown down. So maybe the idea is that they are God's people. They're both saints and sinners, right? So they're in the earth, but they're also important to God in heaven. And then to have them thrown down, maybe that's a description of them being martyred. So being a starry host is just showing that they're part of God's people. And the trampling of the people is the death of those people. And back in First Maccabees, there is a description of how Antiochus tries to destroy the people of God. So there's a story where Antiochus forces, I think it's Matthias or one of the Jewish families, to bring his family before him, and he has 7 sons, and then he demands that they eat the pork that was offered on the altar of Zeus in the temple. So they desecrated the temple, and then they said, eat this pork or else. And then they each refused because they said, this is unclean. And so what happens is that they killed each of the 7 sons as they refused to eat the pork. And then the parents, the last thing that they saw was the death of their last son, and then they poked their eyes out, so the last thing they saw was the death of their children. And that's found in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. So that description fits with this idea of him trampling on the starry hosts, taking God's people and desecrating their religion, their faith, their temple. Okay, in verse 11. Now it uses the word "it" because it's talking about the beast, but it's also talking about...
To be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down.
Yeah, so notice it says it set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. So, because the starry hosts are God's people. So who is the prince of the starry host? That's right, God. But because it's talking about a prince, you usually have a description of a king, and a prince is like the son of the king. So back in Daniel's vision, chapter 7, he saw God the Father, and then he saw the one like a son of man who came before him, and he was worshipped as well, so he had to be God as well. So in essence, that's the Son of God. That's the great prince. So what happens is you got this king of the Greek Empire from the Seleucids, and he wants to be worshipped as if he were God. And then it says he took away the daily sacrifice from him, that is from the people of God, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. So he's describing this, that they ordered the daily sacrifices to be ended. So in the temple, they had sacrifices that were offered to God on a regular basis, and then the army of Judas Maccabeus had to recapture the temple and to rededicate it. And so that rededication happened like 3 years later, but there was a 3-month period from the point that that Antiochus desecrated the temple and started setting up sacrifices. I know he took it, and then 3 months later he offered a sacrifice, and then it was 3 years later that it was rededicated. So what we're going to see is this interesting description of the time period. Okay, let's see, what's the next verse? 12.
Because of rebellion, the host of the saints and the daily sacrifices were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground.
Okay, so the rebellion is where the Greek Empire took over the Jerusalem temple, and the host. So the word "of the saints" is usually an interpretation of the Greek phrase that actually might refer to army. So we're not sure if it's an army, because the word "host," remember, like it talks about the Lord of Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts, which is a description of the angel of the Lord that appeared before Joshua in Joshua chapter 5, when they were about to attack Jericho. And that angel of the Lord, who is the Lord of Sabaoth, is really a description of Jesus, the pre-incarnate Christ, because the word Sabaoth is the word for host in Hebrew. So here it's describing about this rebellion against the hosts of, and it's probably referring to the people of God, picturing them like an army. And then the daily sacrifices were given over to that beast. And it prospered in everything it did. That means that the beast was able to, he wasn't being able to be stopped, and then he threw truth to the ground. And so we know from history that was when the Antiochus IV stopped the sacrifices in the temple in Jerusalem, and his desecration is the reason why the Jewish people got so angry, and they tried to get it back. Okay, verse 13. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, how long will it take for this vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, and the surrender of the sanctuary of the host that will be trampled underfoot. So remember, we saw the word holy one describing like an angel talking to Daniel before. And so back in chapter 7, it mentioned an angel talking to him, but it didn't tell us who that angel was. Now here we're going to find something a little bit different, because we're going to see that it's going to tell us who the angel is in verse 16. But I don't know if we get that far, but but as we look at this description, he's talking about the angel asking the question, how long is this going to last? Now, remember in the book of Revelation, one of the things is like John is asking the question, how's this going to be, or what does this vision mean? And the angel says, and then he describes it to him. And so you see angels, because the word angel means messenger, is God's interpreter, the one who is the intermediary between God and humans. Because in God's glory, sometimes humans are overwhelmed. There's the fear of the Lord from seeing God's vision. Like Isaiah in chapter 6, when he saw the vision of God on the temple, he fell on his face and said, I'm as good as dead. So God often uses angels, especially in the post-exilic period. We see that the transition from angels, mostly just announcing things, to angels being like that intermediary where God's not seen at all, is more in the post-exilic period.
Is this rebellion? I'm a little confused here. Is
Well,
this rebellion the Greeks?
Yeah, they're the ones who are rebelling against God.
Okay. So
Yeah.
They call it a rebellion, but it's a takeover kind of.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's they're taking over the temple, and then the question is, how long are you going to let this happen, God?
Okay.
And so the angel is going to answer in verse 14, and we'll finish with this verse.
He said to me, it'll take 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated.
So and this is the part of the prophetic vision that he had, because he actually is given a specific date. So 2,300 evenings, because there were sacrifices offered in the evening and the morning. So if there's 2,300 evenings, that's evenings and mornings probably refer to the number of sacrifices consecutively ordered or offered on 1,150 days, which in my footnote it says it's the interval between the desecration of the Lord's altar and its reconsecration by Judas Maccabeus on Kislev 25, 165 BC. So the pagan altar was set up by Antiochus back in 168, and was apparently installed almost 2 months after the Lord's altar was removed. So if you take the 2 extra months, earlier I had said 3, but it was actually 2. So the 2 extra months by the time he took it over, and then he offered sacrifices on this new altar he substituted it with, and then you add the 2,300 sacrifices. That's the period that adds up to 1,095 days. But here it mentions 1,150 days mentioned here, because it includes that extra 2 months.
How many years was that?
So 3 years, 2 months.
Okay, 3 years.
3 years, 2 months. So is the 3 years of the sacrifices being offered to Zeus, and before they reconsecrated it, and the 2 months between the taking down of God's altar and the putting up of the altar to Zeus. So he's looking ahead in the future. The Jewish people are being told that someday they're going to be attacked by this new evil empire, and all hope is not lost, because eventually even this terrible thing, the desecration of the temple in Jerusalem, will be won. It will be won back. The Maccabees are going to fight against the Greeks, and they're going to be able to rededicate it. And it's even prophesied. So just imagine when that finally did happen, the people could have hope that it wasn't the worst thing that could ever happen, because it would be brought back. But historical critical scholars usually say this is so exact there's no way that he wrote this before the time that it actually happened. So they would say that the book of Daniel had to have been finished after 165 BC based on this prophecy that happened in 165 BC. And so, is that true? From a perspective of a historical critical scholar, if you want to keep saying you can't see the future and the only way you can write about it is if it already happened, how do you explain the Romans? And for the fact is that the Roman Empire didn't take over till 64 BC, right? And that's when they just took over. Well, no, it's 64 BC in Jerusalem, right? So the Roman Empire took over Israel in 64 BC, and at that point, there's no way that the book of Daniel could be written that late, because there was already copies of the book of Daniel translated from the Hebrew into the Greek in the 200s. During the time of the Greek Empire, most of the Jews were speaking Greek, and so they actually translated the Bible into Greek. So there was already copies of the book of Daniel in other languages long before the Romans ever came around. So it's impossible to keep pushing the date of writing further and further off in order to get rid of this idea that the prophecies can't be futuristic. They can only be looking backwards. And that's kind of a modern day, it's a way of not believing in miracles because we want to explain things from naturalistic perspectives. And even though these historical critical scholars, a lot of them claim to be Christians, but they believe God only works in natural ways. So, that's why they would say things like, God created the world using evolution. God used prophets that prophesied after the fact. But if you keep getting rid of the miracles, then how do you explain Jesus born of a virgin? How do you describe Jesus as a man and God at the same time? How do you describe God dying? And how do you describe God at all? God is spiritual, so if you want to get rid of all the spiritual, supernatural stuff, then there can't be a God. So ultimately, historical critical... That's right. Historical critical methodology pushes the envelope into disbelief, into atheism. But Daniel wasn't writing to atheists, he was writing to believers. And those believers were encouraged, and so are we when we face our, opponent, whatever it's the Greeks, the Romans, or the Antichrist, or atheists, or anybody who wants to destroy Christians. Okay. So next week we'll start on verse 15.